Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Andrew Jackson, who's one of the more polarizing presidents in American history and has really done more than any president we've talked about probably since Washington to remake the way the federal government works. So let's dive back into Jackson again by telling an anecdote about Jackson that helps reveal his character. So, Jackson was the first sitting U.S. president to be assaulted, in that when he was at an event at one point, a man walked up and punched Andrew Jackson in the face. Andrew Jackson did his typical thing, just staring at the guy, blood dripping from his nose as the man was wrestled away. And in the aftermath of this, Jackson is reported to have said to one of the people next to him, quote, "Had I been standing when he struck me, he never would have left alive." This continues to establish the mythos of Andrew Jackson and his his personality as a tough individual who was willing to stand up and fight for, or in this case, not fight, be totally unflapped regardless of whatever the situation was. So here's our objectives for today. Let's move on. Andrew Jackson made it his goal to destroy Henry Clay's legacy, and so that meant trying to rip apart the American system. Hopefully at this point you understand why Jackson hated Henry Clay, but obviously a combination of political and personal issues led these two guys to be enemies, and they were basically fighting for the ideological and political soul of the West. So Henry Clay's American system was his legacy. He had hoped that these canals and protective tariffs would help bind the country together and make the United States into a large and successful manufacturing power. And so Jackson is going to start vetoing bills designed to further the American system. One good example of this is the Maysville Road veto. Jackson lays out his basic argument here, namely strict construction. And despite the fact that the Maysville Road bill passed with significant support from the North and the West, in the South it was opposed, and Jackson vetoed it. This, of course, is going to upend Henry Clay's attempts to continue to bind the country together, and is going to further deepen the divide and the animosity between the two men. Next, you've got the nullification crisis over the protective tariff. As we hopefully remember, the Tariff of 1828, or the Tariff of Abominations, was passed at the end of John Quincy Adams' term, partially to help support the American system, and also partially to politically hurt John Quincy Adams, because the tariff was probably unreasonably high. South Carolina did not like it. Here we see a political cartoon with a funeral for free trade, because, of course, this tariff prevents South Carolina from buying cheaper foreign goods while forcing them to buy more expensive American-made products. South Carolina, and you should pause and read and answer the questions about this, but they are going to articulate yet again the doctrine of nullification, by which this law, because they argue it is against the Constitution, should not have to be enforced. And so South Carolina is going to refuse to collect this tariff and is going to continue to attempt to bring in manufactured goods and sell them without collecting the tariff. So this is going to theoretically destroy the tariff, at least in South Carolina, and is going to be a massive challenge to the power of the federal government and the Jackson administration. Jackson is going to say, quote, "If this doctrine had been established at an earlier day, the Union would have been dissolved in its infancy. The excise law in Pennsylvania, the embargo and non-intercourse laws in the eastern states, the carriage tax in Virginia, were all deemed unconstitutional and were all more unequal in their operation than any of the laws now complained of. But fortunately, none of those states discovered that they had the law right now claimed by South Carolina. I consider, then, the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union." And so this is going to lead to a super awkward dinner conversation between Andrew Jackson and his vice president, John C. Calhoun, with Jackson toasting and saying, quote, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." And John C. Calhoun saying, "The union next to or second to our liberty most dear." Then they have a super awkward staring contest. And after the dinner, it's reported that Jackson said to Calhoun, "John C. Calhoun, if you secede your state from my nation, I will secede your head from your body." We don't have accurate historical sourcing on that quote, but based on everything that I know about Jackson, I 100% believe that it happened. Jackson, in response to this, is going to pass what is called the Force Act, which gives him the power to arm tax collectors to send them down to South Carolina and collect the tax. Facing the prospect of the hero of New Orleans riding down, perhaps even himself, at the head of an army of armed tax collectors, South Carolina is going to decide that the tariff is not too bad. John C. Calhoun's going to back down, and South Carolina is not going to be burned to the ground. This is going to further establish the supremacy of the federal government and the individual power of Andrew Jackson. And in the aftermath of this, Jackson and the Democrats are going to pass a different tariff, a lower compromise tariff that's going to alleviate pressure further. Then we've got the next piece of Henry Clay's legacy. So we've already taken out the bank. We've already taken out the internal improvements. We've taken out the tariff. Now we're going to take out the bank. Jackson had always been opposed to the bank. Being a Westerner, he was skeptical of federal institutions, and being a Southern-leaning Westerner, he was skeptical of banks in general, because most Southern slave owners were spectacularly in debt. And so Jackson didn't like the bank. And in 1832, Henry Clay decided to attempt to use this as a wedge issue to help defeat Jackson in the upcoming election. And so Henry Clay and his allies passed through a recharter of the National Bank. The National Bank had been chartered for a 20-year term, and so it was set to expire in 1836. But in 1832, they passed a recharter bill that would give it another 20 years of life. This gave Jackson only two choices. One, allow the bank to go through, sort of going against his political views and possibly alienating Southerners, or veto the bank and hurt himself politically with Northerners and maybe Westerners. Jackson took the bait and said again that the bank is unconstitutional, which is slightly problematic because, McCulloch v. Maryland somewhat established the constitutionality of the bank. But that's neither here nor there. Jackson vetoes the bank, metaphorically defeating the many-headed monster here, which, yeah, I guess. The bank blows up, and now Jackson's got all this surplus money that he needs to figure out what to do with, because the bank is now mostly a dead letter. It's going to exist for another 4 years, but it's very, very clear that no recharter is going to come through at this point. This leads to one of the first assassination attempts in presidential history. An unemployed house painter who was somewhat concerned who thought that he was out of work because of the destruction of the bank. He may have also been mentally unstable. Decided to assassinate the president. He came up with a revolver and pointed it at the president's chest and fired, but the gun misfired. So he pulled out another revolver, pointed it at the president's chest again, fired it again, and this one misfired as well. Jackson then proceeded to start attacking the assailant with his cane, and eventually the assassin had to be saved from Jackson as his security detail pulled Jackson off of the assassin before Jackson could beat him to death. Again, establishing the character of Andrew Jackson. Jackson then funneled the money from the National Bank, into local state banks that help support him. Obviously, this is still federal money. It's not like Jackson's stealing federal money, but all of these banks here now have extra specie reserves, can loan out extra money and make more money, further benefiting Jackson's supporters and allowing him to use the bank money to benefit himself politically. This outraged, of course, Jackson's opponents. Here's Daniel Webster laying out his argument against Jackson. So take a minute and pause and read his argument here. And in the end, his basic argument is that Jackson is usurping the authority of the other branches of government, making himself a monarch. Here we see the famous King Andrew I political cartoon where he's stomping on the Constitution, holding a veto and a royal scepter and a crown, with things like the whole violating the Supreme Court in Indian removal, the veto of the National Bank, the veto of the Maysville Road Bill, and the Force Act, all of which may or may not have been constitutional depending on your interpretation of necessary and proper. But unfortunately for anti-Jackson forces, we have our first major conspiracy theory-backed candidate here. A man named William Morgan was supposedly publishing a book which would reveal all the secrets of the Freemason Association. The Freemasons are mostly a social club for the upper crust of society, but they've often been accused of some sort of conspiracy to secretly control government and politics. It's often pointed to the fact that many of our early presidents were Freemasons to back up this point, but it should also be noted that all of our early presidents were also members of the upper crust of society, and so why wouldn't they be members of a popular social club that catered to the upper crust of society? Anyway, the Freemasons, you got this anti-Mason frenzy that's going to really pick up steam in the 1830s, and the running of the first major third party in American history, the Anti-Masonic Party. So we've got a whole bunch of different groups going on here. We've got Jackson supporters arguing that the bank is not necessary and all these sub-treasuries are going to be fine. We've got the bank folks, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, arguing that Jackson's destruction of the bank is horrible. We've got John C. Calhoun hating everyone who's not South Carolina. We've got the anti-Masons. And then, of course, slavery is also an issue, but not for many people yet. So here's your end result. You can see a couple things here. Obviously, Jackson's going to get reelected. We see a massive spoiler effect happening, especially in the northern states, with votes being split between the anti-Masonic and National Republican ticket. And we see South Carolina taking their political ball and going home and voting for their own candidate, as they're wont to do in future political elections. Unfortunately for Jackson, although he was able to maintain control of the House of Representatives, he lost control of the Senate to Henry Clay and his forces. And so this means for the rest of Jackson's term, he's going to be mostly stymied because the Senate is going to be pretty strongly opposing him. And so he's not going to be able to get a lot done. Specifically, the revolution in Texas is one issue that's going to be on the table. The northern Mexican state of Tejas, which had been at least partially settled by American expats who've been crossing the border, believe me, we're going to spend much more time on this later, had gone into rebellion and defeated the Mexican army. But Texas independence was not recognized by the central Mexican government, at least the one that overthrew the government of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And so what the question of the status of Texas is going to be one that's going to sit in limbo for about a decade until we pick up that thread sometime next unit. But for the United States, we're in political chaos. There's still national Republicans who are opposed to Jackson. The anti-Mason thing is going to mostly die out. South Carolina is still super mad over that whole nullification thing. And we'll leave you with one of my favorite Andrew Jackson quotes that, quote, "After 8 years as president, I have only 2 regrets, that I have not shot Henry Clay or hanged John C. Calhoun." And so, after 2 terms here, we'll let Jackson ride off into the sunset. And for next time, we'll pick it up as the anti-Jackson forces start coalescing into a coherent political party known as the Whigs. So, next time, second party system is going to come back together. And so, for today, hopefully you can answer these questions and assess Jackson's presidency.